Many Western fans will often make a lot of comparisons between Nihon Falcom's Trails franchise and other popular Japanese role-playing games. Some say the battle system's emphasis on turn order and positioning is similar to Grandia. The large cast of playable characters and epic story remind a lot of people of Suikoden. And even the mech battles in the most recent entries draw a lot of comparisons to Xenogears. However, there is one lesser-known title that actually bears a striking resemblance to the early entries in the Trails series. A Korean-made RPG that some people believe directly inspired the franchise's first entry, Trails in the Sky. That game is Arcturus, The Curse and Loss of Divinity. While the game is fairly obscure in the West, Arcturus is considered an all-time classic in its country of origin, and is a very important title in the history of Korea's game industry, and may very well have influenced Falcom's long-running RPG epic. But just what kind of game is Arcturus, and who made it? Before we explain its connections to Trails in the Sky, I think it's important to overview the game itself and its development, in order to properly understand this situation fully. Arcturus is a turn-based RPG that was initially released in South Korea in December of 2000 for Windows-based computers. The title takes place on a continent that is split up into 3 kingdoms, with the player choosing to experience one of 2 scenarios during the game's prologue. One of the scenarios follows a young boy named Sis in the kingdom of Varencia, who runs away from home after his alcoholic father sells the land housing his late mother's grave. While normally timid and indecisive, Sis is egged along by his bratty childhood friend, a quick-tempered girl named Maria that has been dreaming of escaping her small village to go to the big city. Not long after arriving in the city, Maria and Sis stumble into trouble and eventually end up on the run from the law. Thankfully, the two are rescued by a sorcerer named Icebin, who, for unknown reasons, takes the two into his care and teaches them about magic. The sorcerer also tells the children of the Dalent Stones, magical artifacts that were once housed in the imperial capital, and are said to give their owner great power, and are immensely valuable. Seeing dollar signs, Maria decides that she and Sis are going to begin a quest to find these stones, as part of a scheme to get rich quick. The other scenario takes place in the capital of the Republic of the Seven Lords. A young noble playboy named Eluard is summoned by the Prime Minister of the Republic, his uncle Albrix, who entrusts his nephew with an important mission, to collect the Dalent Stones. Apparently, the Empire to the north had sealed the Dalents inside a tower, but a spy informed Albrix that the structure had recently collapsed, and the stones were missing. Eluard's uncle explains that he wishes to keep the stone's powerful magic out of the hands of the Republic's enemies, and, having great respect for his uncle, Eluard accepts the mission. But little does Eluard know that the entire Republic is secretly being controlled by a council of powerful magic users, and the Prime Minister is nothing more than their public-facing puppet that does whatever they tell him. Albric's true motivation for obtaining the stones is to hopefully use their magic to break free of the council's control. But while Eluard is away on his mission, his conniving brother is also plotting his own evil schemes. Eventually, after having a run-in with a mysterious man named Tenzi, the two groups join forces in their shared quest to find the Dalent Stones. The team travels the continent and meets many new companions as they uncover the mysteries surrounding the stones, all while facing many political and biblical threats along the way. And the player will face these threats through the lens of a traditional Japanese-style role-playing game. Characters journey to new locations as they fight monsters, visit towns, level up, and buy equipment. However, what made Arcturus stand out at the time was its focus on storytelling. While plenty of RPGs have epic narratives, Arcturus had a unique blend of slapstick comedy and harrowing drama that was very appealing to Korean fans at the time. In fact, Arcturus is infamous for how dark its story gets in the later half of the game, and the tonal whiplash that sometimes causes. One moment there'll be a goofy scene centered around a fart joke, and the next the player is fighting monsters made out of human corpses. It may sound a bit much, but even to this day, Arcturus' narrative is still well remembered among Korean fans, with the game having a dense script that takes its time building up its world and characters. Additionally, Arcturus is also famous for its semi-real-time battle system. Combat is turn-based, with the player and enemies having to wait for their icon to reach the center of a timeline before they can choose an action. But once they make that action, everything runs in real time. This means that enemies can begin running towards the player to attack while the protagonists are still waiting for their turn. However, if the enemy is far away, the player still has some time to react, since the enemy has to first reach the characters. Speed and positioning play a big factor in battle strategies, and since time almost never stops, battles have a chaotic feeling where all the characters are running around performing actions, with the only pause happening when the command screen pops up. The system is certainly janky at times, with characters often getting stuck in corners or behind obstacles. But its real-time nature and seamless transitions into battles gives the game a satisfying sense of flow and momentum compared to the halting gameplay of its contemporaries. With all these elements, Arcturus was a standout title in Korea's domestic market in the early 2000s, and it still holds a special place in the history of the country's industry. The beginning of the new millennium was a hot point in the history of Korean video games. Right before the industry would move to almost exclusively developing MMOs, several huge package titles were released within a short time of each other. The Korean industry had been maturing throughout the 1990s, and now developers were showing the fruits of the skills they had been strengthening over the past decade. One of these developers was a company known as Gravity, that was founded in 1994 by a man named Hak-Yu Kim. Kim had been working in the industry as a programmer since the early 90s, and was dreaming of making an original RPG at his company. Unfortunately, RPGs required a lot of resources to make, and Gravity was a small studio that had only made a few action games at the time. Around the same period, game design schools had begun popping up in Korea due to the growth of the industry, and they were hiring developers to lecture at their campuses. So, during a dry period in the mid-90s, Hak-Yu Kim got a job lecturing at these schools to help support his company, where he soon hatched a plan to jumpstart his RPG. Since Gravity didn't have the manpower to make the game on their own, he would recruit promising students from these game design schools to work on the project. Kim offered to waive the students' tuition fees if they worked on the game, and after pitching the idea, several students joined the team that would eventually make Arcturus. Inspired by Japanese games like Grandia, as well as the themes of Evangelion and black metal music, Hak-Yu Kim had huge ambitions for his new team to create an RPG with a grand scale. But even with this influx of staff, the task of making an RPG was still too much for Kim and his group of students. So, Hak-Yu Kim forged a partnership with Sonori, a veteran in the Korean game industry that had created several popular RPGs in the 90s, such as Astonish a Story and Forgotten Saga. They agreed to help Gravity because, just like Kim, Sonori had been wanting to create an RPG that was more ambitious than their past titles. Now, with all the developers assembled, the team went to work, with Gravity mainly working on the game's story, design, and programming, while Sonori helped with the graphics, art, and public relations. Arcturus was first revealed to the public in 1998, with Wizardsoft planning to publish the game in summer of 1999. However, the team's huge ambitions caused the game to be delayed several times, until it was finally released in the year 2000. The critical reception to the game was great. Despite the game being buggy and even unfinished in certain areas, Arcturus was compared favorably to other popular Korean RPGs at the time, such as The War of Genesis 3 Part 2. However, almost immediately after Arcturus' release, the game had to be recalled due to a plagiarism scandal. Additionally, sales overall were not great. The fan reception to Arcturus was strong, and initial sales were promising, but Arcturus only ended up selling around 70,000 copies. Piracy was a huge problem in the Korean market at the time, and Arcturus seemed to be yet another victim of illegal downloads. Piracy would become such a huge problem in Korea that it would cause many developers to either run out of business or transition into making online games. In fact, Gravity's next game would repurpose the graphics engine used to make Arcturus to create an MMORPG called Ragnarok Online in the 2000s, a massively successful title that would help guide the Korean industry towards its online future, and would put Hak-Yu Kim on a career path where he would direct many MMOs in the years to follow. So, Arcturus and the many other games released in the period before Ragnarok Online represent a sort of swan song to Korea's packaged game industry, with Arcturus still fondly remembered by fans as one of the greatest domestically produced RPGs of that era. So what does this have to do with Nihon Falcom and the Trails franchise? Well, Falcom has a fairly strong connection to the Korean market. During the 1990s and early 2000s, Korean companies like Mantra and Arion Games consistently helped port and localize Falcom's titles, which led to the company obtaining a strong foothold in the country's market, and its franchises developing a large Korean fanbase over the years. Falcom's relationship with South Korea was not a one-way street either, as the company worked directly with Korean developers to create a number of MMOs in the mid-2000s, and Falcom even localized several Korean-made RPGs for the Japanese market. Falcom's localization initiative began in 1999 with their release of the Rhapsody of Zephyr, a spin-off to the previously mentioned War of Genesis franchise, which eventually led to Falcom also publishing Arcturus itself in 2003. Not long after Arcturus' Japanese launch, Falcom would also release their 6th installment in the Legend of Heroes franchise, Trails in the Sky. Trails would eventually spawn an entire franchise of its own, with dozens of sequels, spin-offs, and ports. But if we look back at Trails in the Sky and compare it to Arcturus side by side, they clearly share a lot of similarities. In terms of presentation, both have 2D character sprites and 3D environments, with even the color palette being pretty similar between the two. Character movement in those 3D environments is also kind of similar, with the mouse and camera controls being almost identical in both games. There are even some design elements that are shared between the two, such as both having a menu that is made to look like a notebook. Trails and Arcturus also both place a large emphasis on storytelling, with each game having very text-heavy scripts. The protagonists of Trails in the Sky, Estelle and Joshua, look very similar to Sis and Maria. Sis and Joshua are feminine-looking young men that have a hidden dark side, and who both have scenes in their games where they cross-dress to the amusement of the heroine. Speaking of heroines, Maria and Estelle are both tomboys with reddish pigtailed hair, and while Maria uses a sword in the final game, early promotional art actually shows her holding a pole staff similar to Estelle. Both games also have a blonde-haired noble that is very flirtatious with women and that wears a white coat and ascot. The battle systems in each game are different, but they both emphasize turn order and character placement. Both games cut to sepia-tone pencil drawings when talking about past events. Both games split their stories up into chapters. Both games have a secret society that is pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Both have a fairly lighthearted tone, but can suddenly become very violent and dark at a moment's notice. And both games even do that thing where doors automatically open when you walk into them, among many other similarities. These commonalities were not lost on Korean fans. The similarities were so striking that some people speculated that Falcom may have even licensed Arcturus' graphics engine to not only create Trails in the Sky, but maybe even their other early 3D games, such as E6. While those rumors were untrue, there did seem to be some direct inspiration going on between Trails in the Sky and Arcturus. When Falcom localized games from outside of Japan, they would often alter the game's content as well, changing character graphics, fixing bugs, and even altering gameplay. It wouldn't be totally out of the question to think that maybe while Falcom was reverse engineering these games, their staff took notes on how other developers created their titles, and maybe even borrowed a few ideas for their own original games. Now, Arcturus is not the only RPG to have many of these gameplay elements and graphical style. Many of these plot points and character types are also well-worn cliches, so you can make the argument that Trails could have been taking inspiration from any number of RPGs from this era. That's certainly true, but Toshihiro Kondo, Falcom's president and one of Trails in the Sky's writers, did recently state in a 2020 interview with a Korean gaming site that one of the designers that was working on Trails in the Sky specifically referred to Arcturus for inspiration while developing the game, basically all but confirming the long-held rumor in Korea that Falcom's staff was looking to Arcturus for ideas while making Trails. Now, I'm not trying to say that Trails in the Sky is a ripoff of Arcturus. There are plenty of points of departure that make the two games very different from each other. There isn't anything like the Bracer Guild in Arcturus, for example, and while some of their characters are similar on a surface level, Estelle and friends are very different from the cast of Arcturus. In fact, if anything, both games actually share a common point of inspiration, that being the third entry in the Legend of Heroes franchise, Prophecy of the Moonlight Witch. Arcturus' co-writer, Se-Young Kim, cited in a blog post that The Legend of Heroes 3 was one of Arcturus' inspirations, along with Dragon Quest IV and Hakyu Kim's love of Grandia. Toshihiro Kondo was also a huge fan of the Moonlight Witch before even joining Falcom, and clearly looked back to that title for inspiration while writing Trails in the Sky. Additionally, not only was Arcturus inspired by the Moonlight Witch, but one of the first games that Hakyu Kim and Se-Young Kim worked on was actually an officially licensed remake of East 2 that was developed in South Korea in the 90s called East 2 Special. In an interesting twist, Korean developers that were inspired by and even made a Falcom game later created an RPG that looped back around and inspired the source of their inspiration. So instead of looking at this situation as one game taking ideas from the other, it is more of a circle of influence, where the two developers played off each other's ideas and, in a way, helped each other grow. It's an interesting web of connections, and just goes to show that you can't always just point to one thing as being the source of an idea. But, next time you play through the newest installment in Falcom's Trail series, know that this huge franchise has its origins somewhat in an RPG created by a plucky team of Korean developers, made up of industry professionals and amateur students that also helped lay the groundwork for one of Korea's biggest online games. Thank you for watching, and if you would like to try playing Arcturus for yourself, you can play the game in English thanks to a fan translation patch released in 2017 that is designed to work with Falcom's DVD release of the title. However, be warned that it is rather buggy, and I ran into a lot of technical problems while trying to play the game myself. See the description below for links to the patch. Oh, and before I go, I wanted to talk about an interesting piece of trivia related to Arcturus that I couldn't fit into the main video. Alongside the game itself, a fully animated opening video was produced for Arcturus. The opening was actually directed by famed Korean-American animator Peter Chung, known for creating MTV's Aeon Flux, with the animation itself produced by a company called Tin House Productions. While the opening doesn't look like Peter Chung's other works, it is very similar in style to Tin House's ambitious sci-fi film called Wonderful Days, with both productions featuring the same mixture of CG animated backgrounds and hand-drawn characters. Tin House does not have a lot of other production credits. However, the studio did also create the pilot episode for Avatar: The Last Airbender in the early 2000s. In fact, the animation director for both Arcturus' opening and Wonderful Days, Young Gi-yoon, was also the animation director and character designer for Avatar's pilot, playing a big part in helping to develop the final look for the show. Pretty interesting, right? Anyway, thank you again for watching.